You are listening to The Mended Man, Pemberton Manor, Book 5, written and narrated by Becky Dowdy. Chapter 1. The End of January. Pax Thayer lay on his back in the dark room, legs straight and toes pointed toward the foot of his bed. He linked his fingers beneath the pillow under his head and closed his eyes in concentration. To the naive observer, he might appear relaxed and comfortable, but the position stretched the tight muscles in his back, as well as his hips and knees, joints that ached from compensating for the pain from the herniated disc in his lumbar spine. Pain that came in sharp, crippling spasms that never failed to catch him by surprise. With his arms butterflied, his elbows pressed flat to the mattress, he also felt almost every inch of the mottled skin that pulled taut up the length of his arms, the silver scars that laced the backs of his hands, and the patches that still discolored his ribcage more than 2 years after his accident. Except it hadn't really been an accident. The meth lab explosion was set off by the guys who detonated the place with a desperately launched Bic lighter as they tried to escape out the back alley. One of them hadn't survived, and the other had lived for a few miserable weeks before succumbing to the trauma of his extensive injuries. No, the only accident in all of this was that Pax had survived, that both he and Brad Hayward, the rookie cop who'd been newly assigned to him, had survived. Unfortunately, neither one of them had walked away unscathed, and Brad would never walk away from anything ever again, at least not on his own 2 legs. They'd amputated both of the kids' mangled limbs just above the knees. By the time Pax had recovered enough from his own injuries to grasp the scope of what had happened, Brad had moved up north to the San Francisco area where he had family to care for him. God, please heal his mind and body. It had become more of a mantra than a prayer over the years, but then praying had never come easy to Pax, even before the event that left him scarred and mutilated on the inside as much as the outside. He believed the man upstairs saved people for a reason. God could be manipulative that way, he sometimes thought cynically. As far as Pax could tell, his reason for being kept alive was to fully understand the burden of responsibility that was his for allowing the untried new kid on the beat to charge into that rat hole of a house first. Pax had managed to drag Brad several yards away from the worst of the flying debris, and then spread himself like a human shield over the lifeless young man before he too lost consciousness. But a huge part of him couldn't help wondering if he hadn't done either one of them any favors. On nights like this, when everything hurt just a little more than usual, he couldn't keep the dark thoughts at bay, the voices that told him maybe they'd both be better off dead. The sound of scampering footsteps in the apartment 1 floor up stirred him from his morose musings, and a smile tugged at one side of his mouth. His vocal cords were irreversibly damaged from inhaling smoke and other toxic chemical fumes, and in spite of a series of reconstructive surgeries, the skin on the left side of his face was still tight, making his bottom eyelid droop a little, and part of his left ear had been removed. His eyebrows would probably always grow in sparse and uneven through the scar tissue, and his nose bore a jagged line that angled from the bridge down over his right cheekbone. Sure, the left side of his mouth went a little wonky when he smiled, but otherwise, his lips, his tongue, all his teeth, had somehow miraculously remained intact and unblemished. He could even grow a mustache if he wanted to. So smile he did, because he could. Lucy, her young daughter Itzy, and the new baby, Oliver, or Ollie he'd been told, had been home from the hospital for several days now, and they seemed to be settling into some semblance of a normal life after the scare they'd had the night Ollie was born. Pax had grown accustomed to hearing the movement and activity overhead after they moved in last Thanksgiving, and he'd missed the muted sounds while they'd been gone the last week or so. He needed to get upstairs to see them, to see for himself that they were all right. He would run to Walmart tomorrow and grab some gifts for the kids, and maybe a small potted plant, non-toxic of course, for the brave young mother. He'd already sent Sean up there with flowers a few days ago. His thoughts drifted back to the night he'd first met Lucy and Itzy, the night Ollie's father, Richard Spencer, had broken into Pemberton Manor and rode the Otis elevator to the 3rd floor in an attempt to get to them. All week long, Pax had heard threatening, vile words coming from upstairs. He recognized it for what it was, having encountered similar altercations on more than one domestic violence call in his career. He'd been concerned enough that he'd spoken to Sean about it, but the young apartment manager had assured him all was quiet on the 3rd floor. The night of the assault, though, Pax heard it again, a man's raised voice, the kind that usually accompanied raised fists. Unwilling to stand by and let it continue unchecked, he'd opted not to wait for the elevator, but to take the stairs instead, in spite of the unpredictable and usually uncooperative state of his back. He'd pushed through the heavy door and into the stairwell, all but stumbling over a terrified Itzy clinging to a very pregnant, and in labor, Lucy Farnsworth. Oliver Farnsworth came into the world almost 3 weeks early that night, but because of Pax's quick, decisive actions, the little family received the help they needed, and the police had been able to apprehend the intruder without a hitch. The old Otis elevator had spit the man out on the 3rd floor, trundled back down to the ground floor, and mysteriously quit running for the night. Then the door to the stairwell where Lucy and Itzy were trying to make their escape inexplicably locked the monster out, keeping the 2 of them safe, and ultimately trapping the guy on the 3rd floor where he roared and howled like a cornered feral cat. Whatever the explanations were for the things that had happened that night, or the things he'd heard, according to Sean, Richard Spencer had never set foot inside the apartment building until that night. Didn't matter to Pax nearly as much as that he'd listened to his gut. His role in getting Lucy and her children to safety had reminded him of why he became a police officer. It was in his nature to protect and serve, to trust his instincts, and for the first time since his career-ending accident, he felt that old familiar stirring of a sense of purpose. Just a flicker, a sputtering spark, but there nonetheless. 2 days later, when his unruly back unclenched long enough for him to feel at least semi-human, Pax adjusted the collar of his shirt and scowled at the hideous mask worn by his reflection in the mirror. Knowing there was nothing more he could do about his appearance, he headed up to the 3rd floor in the capricious Otis elevator, took a deep, galvanizing breath, and knocked on the door of apartment 3C. Even armed as he was with gifts for Lucy and the children, he was pleasantly surprised to be greeted with a warm and genuine welcome. Lucy's cheeks turned the same color as the pale pink pot of kitchen herbs he brought for her, and Itzy gushed about how much she loved elephants while hugging the stuffed pachyderm from him. When he handed Lucy the Matchbox police car for Ollie, he started to apologize. "I know he's a little young for this, but—" Lucy cut him off with a quick smile and a shake of her head. No, this is perfect, Pax, especially coming from you. Absolutely perfect." The tiny baby was sound asleep in a second-hand crib in the corner, but Itsy grabbed Pax's hand and dragged him across the room to show him her new brother. He peered down, a bit awestruck, at one seriously cute baby. In his limited experience, newborns were usually somewhat red and wrinkly, and more often than not, bald. Not Oliver Farnsworth. Even though he'd been born early, Ollie's little cheeks were already plump and pink with good health. His sooty lashes matched the faint slash of eyebrows that furrowed and rose with his baby dreams, and dark wisps of hair peeked out from under the tiny knit cap he wore. Pax felt an unexpected jolt of longing to scoop the child up and cradle him close. He shoved his free hand, Itsy still clutched his other one, in his pocket and just gazed at the infant until it passed. It was probably for the best anyway, since lifting even the smallest thing could sometimes bring him to his knees. Carrying the very pregnant Lucy and Itsy from the stairwell to his apartment that night had been excruciating, but pumped full of adrenaline and with the mind-over-matter predisposition that had made him such a good cop, he'd somehow gotten the job done. But the unsettling yearning that had been awakened in him since that night had him feeling uncomfortable in the tiny apartment. Confident that the little trio was well, Pax didn't stay. Over the next several days, they crossed paths on multiple occasions, at the mailboxes in the main lobby, on the gated front lawn, and then, a few days before he left for yet one more round of procedures at the burn center in Denver, Colorado, the three of them paid him a surprise visit to let him know they'd be praying for him while he was gone.
"We also made you some really, really good bread, Mr. Pax,"
Itsy declared, patting a still warm loaf wrapped in a dishcloth and cradled in her arms like a puppy.
"Just eat it up until it's all gone,"
she told him as she handed it over.
"'Cause we worked hard on that thing, and because it will make you and your tummy so, so, so happy, and it will help you heal fast from the hospital."
Chapter 2. The end of February. In Denver, Pax endured what seemed like his millionth round of skin grafts under the skilled hands of a plastic surgeon at one of the finest burn centers in America. There was, of course, only so much they could do with what they had to work with, and although Pax was grateful for the team who had repaired and rebuilt him over the years, when they brought up scheduling his return in 6 months, he shook his head. No more. He was beyond ready to be done with the effort to bring back something that he knew was forever lost. The decision came with a bittersweet sense of completion. He knew he wouldn't be back. When he was released from the burn center, he returned to California to undergo the long-awaited surgery for his herniated disc. He'd hoped to avoid the procedure, but the injury hadn't responded to any of the myriad forms of therapy he'd tried, so he finally capitulated and went under the knife. Instead of going to a short-term rehabilitation hospital near Midtown, Pax stayed with his mother in her condo in Orange County, where he had all the help and attention he needed while he healed. The end of March. In spite of how anxious he was to get back to the peaceful solitude of his apartment and the comfort of his own bed, when his Uber pulled up outside Pemberton Manor, he couldn't help smiling at the sight that awaited him. Lucy, Itsy, and Ollie were sitting on a blanket on the front lawn, bundled up in warm clothes in the chilly sunshine of the spring morning. The moment Itsy saw him, she snatched a handmade sign off the ground beside her and waved it so frantically he could barely make out the crayon-colored words, "Welcome home, Hero Pax." He'd been exhausted from the long drive, a little edgy and in pain from weaning himself off the prescription pain meds he'd been on in some form or another over the last few years, and inexplicably hungry. His mother had made him an enormous breakfast before sending him off, but he'd spent more than an hour outside with them, just enjoying the fact that he was home. It hadn't taken him long to realize that when he heard the rumble of the Otis in the elevator shaft on the other side of his living room wall in the middle of the morning or afternoon, it was most likely Itsy, with Lucy and Ollie in tow, making their rounds to the different neighbors they'd come to know in the building. If he left his door ajar, they stopped by to bring him crayon sketches that probably qualified as abstract art, since he couldn't decipher any of the creatures Itsy insisted were there. But he dutifully taped the papers up on his fridge, and as the weeks passed, he couldn't help but smile at his growing collection. Besides, those drawings signified something else to Pax, something good, something positive, something hopeful. For the first time since the explosion, he found himself looking forward to the happenings taking place outside his apartment, especially when those happenings involved Lucy Farnsworth and her delightful children. Sure, it meant changing his schedule a little to accommodate them, but his doctor had been on him to get back to a nighttime sleep schedule, and knowing he had to be presentable by 10 a.m. was good incentive to do so. The end of April. As spring began to wind down, the days grew longer, and the weather cooperated beautifully. One morning, Pax came home from a doctor's appointment to find the Farnsworth gang once again hanging out in the front yard of Pemberton Manor. By all appearances, it seemed their tiny apartment had upended itself onto a blanket spread out on the lush green grass. Itsy lay at the center of the quilt, staring up at the drifting clouds overhead, apparently oblivious to the toys and books and games surrounding her. Lucy and Ollie sat on a bench nearby, under the arching branches of a mulberry tree. Pax barely made it through the front gate before Itsy launched herself at him, wrapping her scrawny little arms around his legs. He tensed at the impact. Even though she was just a tiny thing, he still had to be careful with his back. His doctor assured him just that morning that everything looked good, that the surgery had been a success, but that Pax still needed to take precautions while his body continued to heal. Having finally gained some relief from the pain he'd suffered over the last several years, he was in no hurry to overdo things. Itsy craned her head back to look up at him, and in a tragic voice exclaimed,
"We're trapped in this place, Mr. Pax. Trapped like a princess in a tower. Only we don't even have a tower. Please rescue us. Please, pretty please. 'Cause we can't go to the park ever again now that the bad man stole Mommy's purse."
A sharp jab of concern pierced his chest at the child's words, and he eyed Lucy where she sat under the tree. She looked crabby and out of sorts, the corners of her mouth drawn down, dark circles under her eyes. Her shoulders drooped as she rhythmically jostled the 3-month-old Ollie, who whimpered and fussed against her shoulder. Her exhaustion was a palpable thing. Pax had heard the baby's inconsolable tears late into the night several times since getting home from his mother's place. He'd lie in bed wishing he could somehow help the little trio upstairs. Being a single parent wasn't an easy task. His mother had raised him and his little sister on her own from the time Pax was only a little older than Itsy, and a colicky baby only highlighted the fact that there was no backup, no help to be had. But the muffled sounds of Ollie's fussing and Lucy's rhythmic pacing that accompanied her sing-song crooning upstairs were actually a comfort to Pax when he too was up in the wee hours of the night. There was a certain kind of solace that came with knowing he wasn't lying awake in the dark all alone. "What happened?" Pax ventured to ask when he lowered himself to the bench next to Lucy. Even though his pulse ratcheted up in alarm at the thought of these three enduring yet another violation after Richard Spencer's attack, he intentionally kept his voice calm. He didn't want Lucy to brush him off. Her go-to response was to tell people that she was fine, even when it was obvious that she wasn't. To his surprise, and perhaps because she was too weary to attempt pretending all was well, Lucy filled him in on the purse-snatching incident that had taken place while he was gone to Denver back in March, how Stella Carnegie in apartment 1B had gone out of her way to help them. Itzy added her own flamboyant commentary.
I really like that Lala lady, Mr. Pax. She's a specular grandma.
Spectacular, Lucy said, brushing a curl away from her daughter's face. And yes, she really has become a spectacular grandma to us. Why didn't you tell me about this? Pax asked. But having gotten to know Lucy a little, he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. You needed to focus on getting well, Pax. She turned to Itzy and gave her a stern look. We didn't say anything because we didn't want Mr. Pax to worry, did we?
That's right,
Itzy confirmed, oblivious to the chiding note in her mother's voice. Then she suddenly remembered that she was supposed to be upset.
But now Mommy won't let us go anywhere ever, never again.
She covered her face with both of her little hands.
I'll die in this place, Mr. Pax, alone and unloved, like Sleeping Beauty.
She wrinkled her nose and made a face behind her splayed fingers.
Except I'm pretty sure it will take more than a dumb kiss to make me come back to life.
A dumb kiss, Pax teased. You know, kisses can be pretty powerful magic, I hear. To his dismay, the moment the words left his mouth, his mind went immediately to thoughts of what kind of powerful magic kissing Lucy would elicit. He ducked his head, unable to bring himself to look at the woman beside him, ashamed as he was at the direction his imagination had taken, afraid she'd know what he was thinking, unable to face the repulsion he'd surely find in her eyes.
Really?
The little girl lowered her hands to her hips and screwed up one side of her mouth as she peered up at him.
Magical kisses? I don't know about that, mister. Seems kinda suspicious to me.
Suspicious, Itzy. Lucy patiently corrected her daughter, seemingly unaware of Pax's discomfort. But Mr. Pax is right, baby. Kisses from the right person for the right reason are like magic, miracles even. Like when you have a boo-boo and I kiss it for you. It makes your owie hurt a little less, right? And it helps you to be a little braver too, doesn't it? Pax sighed with relief that his true feelings hadn't been exposed. Feelings for Lucy and her children that he was just beginning to come to terms with himself. This little family was quickly becoming dear to him in ways he knew he shouldn't entertain, and the last thing he wanted was to make them uncomfortable around him. A frown of concentration drew Itzy's delicate brows together.
I guess so,
she said slowly.
I'm going to have to think about it some more before I can believe it completely, but only later, 'cause all this brain can think about right now is that we can't never go to the park ever again.
And with that, her little legs buckled beneath her, and she dropped to the ground in a heap. Disturbed, not by the child's display of angst, but by the purse-snatching story he'd just been told, Pax braved meeting Lucy's gaze. I don't want to intrude on your family time, but if you don't mind my company, I'd be happy to take you, so you don't have to go by yourself, he added unnecessarily. Lucy's reaction to his offer had his pulse jumping erratically. He could see some kind of battle going on behind those chocolate velvet eyes, but he recognized it for what it was. She wanted to take him up on it, of that he was certain, But the young mother bore her own scars, both inside and out, acquired from trusting the wrong people. "No obligation, okay?" he murmured softly, looking away so she wouldn't feel compelled to assuage him. "I just want you to know that I'm available if you need someone else to walk with you. Besides, it would do me good to get out of my apartment more." When she didn't respond right away, he started to rise. Maybe he should just head inside before making things more awkward. "Do you mean it?" Lucy spoke so quietly that for a moment he wondered if she'd intended to say the words out loud. But then she added, "Are you sure it wouldn't be a bother? You've done so much for us already." He sat down again and smiled at her. "Yes, I mean it." From her arms, Ollie stared over at him, his fussing momentarily quieted. "No, it wouldn't be a bother. And you'd be doing me a huge favor by letting me join you." He winked at Itzy, who was rising like a phoenix out of the ashes of her despair, her eyes darting back and forth between her mother and Pax. "Besides, I can't even remember the last time I was on a swing."
Oh, please, oh, please, Mommy."
Itzy was on her feet, hopping from one foot to the other in time with her pleading words.
"Please, please, please say yes to his purple soul already. I need the park so bad, even more than I need to potty right now."
Proposal. Lucy narrowed her eyes at her daughter. "Do you need to use the bathroom, sweetie?"
"Yes, Mommy,"
Itzy confirmed, her tiptoe two-step getting more frantic by the moment.
"Really bad."
Lucy glanced around at the myriad of gear she'd brought down to the front yard. A stroller, a diaper bag, and Itzy's backpack, along with a blanket and all the things scattered atop it.
"Mommy,"
Itzy whimpered,
"hurry."
"Oh dear." Lucy turned pleading eyes on Pax. "I'm so sorry. I hate to ask, but would you mind taking Ollie while I run Itzy inside?" She stepped closer to him, but then hesitated. "I mean, if you're okay with holding him, he's kinda cranky these days." Pax didn't even have to think about it. He held his arms out for Ollie. "I wouldn't mind at all." His smile broadened. He was unable to quell his anticipation. He loved babies. He loved children. At one time, he'd thought he'd marry one day and have half a dozen mini Paxtons running around his home. Several of his friends had children already, and whenever he got to hold one, he marveled at how tiny they felt cradled in his big arms, compact and fragile at the same time, how they settled into the crook of his elbow, the way they nestled so trusting against his broad chest. Lucy thrust the wide-eyed 3-month-old at him with a relieved, "Oh, thank you." Then she grabbed Itzy's hand, and the two of them dashed across the lawn toward the front porch. "Can you hold it until we get upstairs, or do we need to see if Lala's home?" he heard Lucy ask the little girl as they disappeared inside the building. Struck with an overwhelming emotion akin to holy adoration, he thought this might have been similar to how the shepherds felt when they first beheld the Christ child. Pax gazed down into the enormous gray eyes of the baby boy, staring back up at him. "Hello, little man," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. It would never completely lose that gravelly edge to it, but when he spoke softly, it wasn't quite so abrasive. "Do you want to tell me all about that bad man who stole your mommy's purse, Do you? I bet you can't wait until you're grown up enough to protect your womenfolk. But until you do, maybe I can cover for you, one man to another." He settled the baby more securely against him, pleased when Ollie let out a little grunt of contentment, one tiny fist flailing in the general direction of Pax's chin. He ran his fingertips down the curve of a plump cheek, his heart squeezing when the baby smiled, his tiny mouth opening and closing reflexively. "What do you think, Oliver, my man? Would you be all right with that?" Pax continued to bond with the little guy until Itzy burst out of the front door of Pemberton Manor and charged down the walkway toward them, Lucy hurrying along behind her.
"Mr. Pax! Mr. Pax!"
the child called out, breathless with exuberance.
"Mommy says you can go with us to the park, even today if you want. And you want to, right? That's what you said, right?"
She lurched to a stop in front of the bench where he sat, clasped her hands in front of her in a pleading gesture, and bounced up and down on her heels. "I'd love to go to the park with you," Pax assured them both. He was pretty sure he hadn't stopped smiling from the moment Lucy accepted his offer. And what better day than today? At that moment, Ollie smiled and farted, making Pax laugh out loud.
"'Scuse you, stink boy,"
Itzy admonished, shaking a finger at her brother as she leaned forward and wrinkled her nose. She rolled her eyes, a big sisterly look of long suffering on her face. To Pax, she said,
"That guy tosses our biscuits all the time, Mr. Pax. You might want to get a clothespin for your nose if you're going to spend any time with him. 'Cept clothespins hurt when you put them on your nose, but since I'm not allowed to hold Ollie with only one hand, I just have to get used to it. I'm not allowed to barf on him either, so—"
She shrugged.
"Anyway, I have to clean up now so we can go to the park."
Then she spun on her heels and made for the blanket to gather up her things. Pax glanced over at Lucy to find her cheeks bright pink, her hand on her chest. He wasn't sure if the heightened color was from the exertion of keeping up with Itzy or from embarrassment over her daughter's verbal outpouring. Either way, the blush only made the young mother prettier, and he found he couldn't look away. Chapter 3. The End of Summer. They'd gone to the park together several times a week since then, outings that Pax was certain he enjoyed as much as the children. Ollie's little round face lit up at the sight of him, the baby's gap-toothed smile melting his heart every single time. Itzy, in her guileless, precocious way, had claimed his heart as well. When she slipped her tiny hand in his and dragged him toward the swings, or when she giggled at his Quasimodo impression, he was 100% at her beck and command. Itzy's favorite Disney hero was the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and the girl hero-worshipped the misshapen creature.
"I love, love, love Quasimodo, 'cause I just want to hug him, just like I want to hug you."
Lucy, of course, had been appalled the first time Itzy had made the comparison between the Hunchback and Pax, but Pax just laughed and agreed with the child. "Let's not pretend, Luce," he said with a gentle smile. "I'm not the handsome prince in this fairy tale." "Well, you're beautiful to me," Lucy shot back, surprising them both with her candor. Embarrassed, she stammered a bit. To us, in all the ways that matter," then ducked her head to hide her flaming cheeks from him. "Thank you." Pax spoke quietly, like he would to a skittish animal, hoping with every fiber of his being that she meant it in all the ways that mattered to him, too. If Lucy could see past his bumps and lumps and broken places, maybe, just maybe. Pax knew his outward appearance didn't represent the kind of man he was on the inside. In fact, he'd crossed paths with many a beast disguised as handsome princes while he'd worn the uniform of his office. Nor was he naive enough to believe that the world would ever treat him as though his scars were invisible. And honestly, he couldn't blame them. Things were significantly better now after all the corrective surgeries, skin grafts, and extensive therapy both physical and psychological, but the fact remained that his disfigurement made him stand out in the wrong way, made folks uncomfortable in their own intact skin. He understood. He really did. Lucy and her children accepting him just the way he was, with his patchy skin and twisted features. His mom called it seeing people with the heart, and Pax thought that about summed it up. And every moment spent with the endearing Farnsworth family healed places in his heart and soul that he thought would never mend, filling every day with hope he thought he'd lost. Chapter 4. The end of October. Pax pushed himself up to sit on the side of his bed. For whatever reason, sleep was evading him. He rolled his shoulders slowly, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His mind drifted to a conversation he'd had with Lucy just yesterday. Ollie had just cut 2 teeth, one right after the other, so they weren't getting a whole lot of sleep in the apartment above him either. "I don't mind being awake in the middle of the night with him," Lucy told Pax with a shrug. They were at the park, and he held Ollie so Lucy could push Itzy on the swing. "I mean, maybe I can't write or do anything really productive, but I try to remember to use that time to pray. It's easier for me to talk to God when the world has shut down for the night, even if Ollie isn't cooperating." She turned and crooked her fingers at her son as if she was going to tickle him, and the boy squirmed and half snorted, half giggled in Pax's arms. "I ask God to put people on my mind who might need someone to pray for them," Lucy continued, "and without fail, he does." "I wouldn't call that unproductive, then," Pax countered. Lucy shrugged again. "I guess it's just hard to measure, you know? With my writing, I try to get in a certain number of words each day, but that sounds a little sanctimonious when we're talking about praying." She lifted her nose in the air and in a snooty voice said, "Today I prayed 2,000 words in 2 hours. Give me my gold star now." "Yeah, that might not go over so well in the heavenly realms," Pax agreed. "But I'm sure God measures things differently than we do anyway." He was beginning to make some tentative steps toward reconciling with the God he believed in. Because of the people he was getting to know at Pemberton Manor this year, he was learning to look at his current circumstances, and maybe even his future, through a different set of lenses than the dark ones he'd gotten so comfortable wearing. He still felt the enormous burden of responsibility for Brad's injuries, and he still couldn't fathom anything more than friendship coming of his relationship with Lucy, as much as he wanted to believe it were possible. But if one of the reasons God had kept him alive was so he could be the friend that Lucy and her children needed right now, then Pax might agree that maybe the Almighty's plan wasn't such a bad one after all. "The best part about it," Lucy continued, "when I'm not focusing on my own problems, I'm not nearly as stressed out, which inevitably means that we all get back to sleep sooner." "Makes sense to me," Pax said with a slow nod. Ollie kicked his sturdy little legs against Pax's midsection, making him grunt in surprise. The kid was a hefty little ball of energy, and Pax didn't know how the diminutive Lucy lugged him around all day without her arms giving out. "I'd like to think the person I'm praying for gets some kind of benefit from my middle-of-the-night conversations with God, too." She gave Itzy another lazy push, the unseasonably warm fall sun making them all a little languid in the middle of the afternoon. It didn't help that none of them were sleeping much. "I hope you think of me in your prayers." Pax did his best to keep his voice casual. He may not deserve them, but he would take all the prayers he could get, especially coming from Lucy. She smiled shyly over at him again. You're usually at the top of my list." It took him a moment, but he finally managed a cool response. "Thank you. If the way I feel right now is any indication, then yes, your prayers are in good working order." "I'm glad," she murmured, still smiling. Sitting there in the darkness now, Pax considered her words carefully, wondering if he might find some solace in a few prayers of his own. The watch on his nightstand told him it wasn't quite 11 p.m., which made him chuckle. This time last year, Pax would have been preparing for a long and painful vigil through the endless night. Now here he was, frustrated because he wasn't asleep before midnight. He had a lot to be grateful for, and with Thanksgiving around the corner, praying suddenly seemed rather apropos. He'd pray for the little trio upstairs. He was pretty sure they were all tucked in for the night. He hadn't heard a peep from them in a couple of hours. But even if they were sleeping, he figured they could still benefit from a blessing or two. Although Lucy might be up writing. He imagined her curled up in the office chair at her pretty antique writing desk, her laptop open, her brows furrowed in concentration as her fingers tapped away on the keys. She would be dressed in her standard cold-weather uniform of leggings and an oversized sweatshirt, her feet in fuzzy socks, a cup of hot chocolate or herbal tea in the spill-proof mug he'd given her for her birthday back in May. She had admitted her biggest fear was that she'd accidentally spill something on her laptop and ruin the thing. "I can't write without a hot drink close at hand, but between my clumsiness and Itzy's exuberance, one of these days, I just know my computer's going to get doused." When she'd opened his gift and read the cliché but oh-so-relevant hashtag #MWriting, written in pink on the side of the olive-green mug, she'd hugged him hard. "It's perfect," she'd whispered when she stepped back, then hugged the mug to her chest and smiled up at him. "Especially coming from you." Pax shook his head at the memory of how her words made him feel. Besotted. She sometimes used that word in those romance novels she wrote, didn't she? He'd read her books, every one of them, and although they weren't his preferred genre, she was definitely his preferred author. Besotted indeed. He sat on the edge of his bed and said a short prayer for Lucy and her children, and for her relationship with her parents. He knew how much she longed for things to be different between her and them, so Pax asked God if he wouldn't mind stepping in with a miracle or two. Lying back down in bed, he offered up his perfunctory prayer for Brad, and then added another one for his mom and sister, too. He was asleep in less than 15 minutes. Chapter 5. The end of November. Pax stood at his window and peered out at the night sky. There were no clouds, and the moon still hadn't made its ascent from behind the mountain range, so the stars shone brightly. It looked to him as if God had tossed a handful of diamonds into the air, and they'd stayed there, suspended for eternity, shimmering down on the earth below. It was chilly for the end of November in Southern California, but he didn't mind, especially not after their unseasonably warm Thanksgiving weekend. His phone rang, startling him out of his reverie, and he crossed to the coffee table where he'd left it. "Hi, Pax." He heard the wobble in her voice as she greeted him over the phone. "It's Lucy from upstairs." "Hey, Lucy," he acknowledged. He wanted to tell her he'd know it was her even if her name hadn't popped up on his screen. Just the intake of breath before she spoke gave her away. That's how well he knew her. "How have you been?" Thanksgiving had fallen late in the month, and although they'd seen each other several times since then, their interactions had been brief because of conflicting schedules, cranky kids, or just the increased hustle and bustle of the holidays. With Christmas practically around the corner, he was sure Lucy had her plate full with figuring out how to make this time special for her little family. They'd both been away from Pemberton Manor for much of the Thanksgiving weekend. Pax had spent a few days at his mother's place in Orange County. His sister, June, had managed to get home for the holiday, too, and the visit had been extra special for all of them. Lucy, Itzy, and Ollie had been officially invited to a noontime Thanksgiving dinner at her parents', after which they'd accompanied Sarah and Grace to the Winters' annual Thanksgiving weekend at the family home in Oak Glen, apple country in the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains. Lucy and Itzy had regaled him with tales of their weekend with the Winters, how they'd indulged in their second Thanksgiving dinner that same evening with as many of the extended Winters family as could be there. Then they went Christmas tree shopping on Friday, had a Christmas decorating party on Saturday, and attended church with the family on Sunday. Following the morning's worship service, they loaded up casseroles, pies, and other holiday goodies they'd made in the Winters' kitchen all weekend long, and attended a potluck brunch at Snowline Apple Orchard, where the community came together to celebrate another year's fruitful harvest.
They had the best and cutest little yummy apple cinnamon donuts, but they were so fat they had no holes in the middle,
Itzy exclaimed, gesticulating wildly with her hands as she spoke. Apple cinnamon, Lucy said.
Apple cinnamon.
Itzy furrowed her brows and tried again, determined to get it right.
Apple cinnamon,
she iterated slowly, drawing each syllable out. Good job, Itzy. Lucy smiled down at her daughter and brushed her fingers over the girl's shoulder.
Even Ollie loved those things, Itzy continued. But I didn't let him eat too many in case his tummy started hurting or he barfed all over everyone.
Clearly, the mini apple donuts were a hit with the indomitable Itzy Farnsworth. Pax knew that things were still difficult between Lucy and her parents. Even though the reserved elder Farnsworths were now opting to be involved in their grandchildren's lives, they still hadn't quite forgiven Lucy for the embarrassment and shame she'd brought on them when she'd gotten pregnant at 16, and then refused to abort or give up her baby for adoption. How are things at your parents' place? He asked her. I've heard all about your time with the Winters family from Itzy, he added with a chuckle. Oh, yes, she's still talking about it, at least to her stuffed animals, since they can't change the subject. Even Ollie's eyes start to glaze over when Itzy brings it up, she said with a little laugh. But the kids love the Christmas tree they picked out for our apartment. You need to come up and see it, Pax. It's a Charlie Brown Christmas tree if I've ever seen one. We even wrapped one of Ollie's blue blankets around it since we don't have a tree skirt. I will, he promised. Maybe tomorrow. That would be nice. She paused, then added, I feel like I haven't seen you in ages. He couldn't agree more, and promised to come up early for a cup of coffee in the morning. But what about your parents? He prodded. It hadn't escaped his notice that Lucy seemed to be avoiding the question. Was that good, too? It was fine. It was okay. She sighed and then admitted in a rush of words, it was awkward and uncomfortable and made me grateful for my own apartment and all the people I call family who live here at Pemberton Manor. She chuckled softly before saying, My mom was very sweet to the kids, so that was good. Which meant, he thought, that her mother had not been sweet to Lucy. Then I'm especially glad your time with Grace and Sarah's family was fun. Oh, Pax. She sighed again, dreamily this time. It was like something from a Hallmark movie. It even snowed up there on Saturday night after we got all the Christmas lights up outside. It was so beautiful, and just like what you'd imagine a family get-together should be. He smiled at her wistful response and wished he'd been there to see her reaction in the moment, to stand beside her in the falling snow and take in the beauty and wonder of the season together. We even gathered around the piano and sang Christmas carols while Mrs. Winters played the piano, and Luke, one of the 4 brothers, 4 Pax, 4 brothers. Can you imagine? Anyway, Luke played the guitar and everyone sang all these harmonies, and it was so sweet and nostalgic, and I actually cried. Then I got super embarrassed, even though they all didn't seem to mind my blubbering. It wasn't a stretch to figure out where Itzy got her run-on sentence habit from. "I wish I'd been there," he said, out loud this time. He probably wouldn't have added his scratchy voice to the family choir, but he loved the old carols as much as the next guy did, and the idea of a big family gathered around a piano seemed to resonate with the very essence of Christmas. "I wish you'd been there too," Lucy said. "You would have loved it. Not that you didn't have a great time with your mom and sister, I'm sure," she quickly amended. Pax assured her he knew what she meant. Then, after a brief, not uncomfortable silence, he said, "Maybe the 4 of us can go for a drive sometime in the next week or 2 and check out the Christmas lights around town." "That would be so much fun," Lucy gushed breathlessly. "Itzy all the way." But then he remembered the way her voice had sounded when she first called. "Is everything all right, Lucy? You sounded, I don't know, uncertain when you first called." Right, yes." She took a deep breath. "And I'm sorry. I just noticed what time it was. I'm sorry to bug you so late, but, well, since I've already got you on the phone, I have a huge favor to ask of you." "Anything," he returned without hesitation. Lucy wouldn't ask if she didn't have a real need. "And you know you can call me any time, day or night." It was only 9 o'clock, which meant the kids were probably sound asleep, and Lucy had some time to herself to work. "It's my best writing time," she told him. "My brain seems to be at its most creative after the kids have gone to bed, although half the time I just sit there and stare at their perfect little sleeping faces," she admitted with a soft chuckle. "I spend all evening counting down the minutes until I can put them to bed. Then the moment they're asleep, I miss them and wish they were awake again. Being a mother is one twisty-turny roller coaster ride, Pax, I'm telling you." But Pax knew better. Lucy didn't have an unproductive bone in her body. She spent every spare moment working on her books, because it was her books that allowed her to be a stay-at-home mom to her precious children, and she didn't take any of it for granted. Headed up by Grace and Sarah, a bunch of the Pemberton Manor residents had combined resources and had given Lucy another writing-related birthday gift, a handheld recording device that would transcribe her dictation onto her computer. Lucy's eyes had welled up when she opened it, and she thanked them all profusely, then spared no time in putting the equipment to good use. Her production had more than tripled since then, and she was now releasing a book about every 2 months. She astounded him with her tenacity, her will to scrap and scrabble to stay alive, to even thrive, and how hard she worked to provide for the little family entrusted to her. "It's my parents," Lucy began, then hesitated, cleared her throat, and started again. "My mother called me about an hour ago, and I've been stewing about it since. They want to come visit us here, to get together with me and the kids, to talk." "To talk?" Pax scowled, glad she couldn't see his expression. She always seemed a little bruised and vulnerable after time spent with her parents, and they'd just had her over a week ago. He didn't like the sound of things, but he tried to be optimistic. "Well, that's good news, right? They want to see more of you? See where you live?" "Of course," she confirmed quickly, then said in a more hesitant tone, I think it is. Pax's mind spun as he tried to come up with a motive behind her folks' sudden desire to engage with their daughter and grandchildren on Lucy's turf. Over the months he'd spent getting to know Lucy, he'd learned that her parents had all but thrown her to the wolves. That was his metaphor, not hers. Lucy never said an unkind word about her mother and father. Pax understood that tough love was a necessity at times, but knowing Lucy, he could not reconcile their behavior toward their daughter and grandchildren. Granted, since Ollie's birth, Lucy had taken both kids to see their grandparents on numerous occasions, but they'd always met at the family home, and the visits had never been for more than a few hours at a time. And to talk? Why hadn't they talked at Thanksgiving? "What's your favor?" He was having a hard time figuring out what part he might play in things. "You can say no, okay?" she began. "Lucy," Pax said, a warning in his voice. "How can I help? What do you need?" He secretly wished she would declare that she needed him, just him, but he shook his head quickly to dislodge the thought. "Focus, Pax." "Well, I don't want to entertain them in my tiny place, that's for sure," she blurted out, the words rushing out of her mouth again. I do want them to see where I live and to know that I'm fine and all that. I want them to see it for themselves, you know? But I don't think I could bear having them sit here in my little sanctuary long enough to start judging it and judging us, judging me." Pax opened his mouth to speak, got out a "no, that," but she started up again, talking right over him. "I know they're going to judge me anyway. It's not like they'll be getting a grand tour or anything. There's only so much to tour in a one-room apartment, right?" When she paused, Pax thought he was supposed to answer, "Sure." "But this is my place, and I've done things my way without their help thus far, and I don't want them to have the opportunity to make me feel like I need more than what I have. At least not from them." "I see," Pax said, still trying to figure out how he could help. Did she want to bring her parents down to his apartment? But that was ridiculous. If anything, she should take them to Stella Carnegie's on the first floor. Her apartment was the largest one in the building, with 2 bedrooms and a separate kitchen and sitting room, and Stella would be happy to help out Lucy and her children in that way. "So I was thinking, well, I want to meet them at the park. I feel like I'll be more composed if we meet in public first. Then, when I'm ready, I'll invite them to come here. It'll be their decision to come over then, but on my terms, you know?" "I think that's wise." Pax kept his comments careful, not because he needed to be guarded around Lucy, but because he sensed she needed to take ownership of the decisions she was making. "So, I was wondering—" Lucy stalled, but when he remained quiet, she continued, the wobble back in her voice. "I was wondering if you'd go to the park with me, with us." The request came out on one long breath. "And I mean it. You can say no," she added quickly. Pax furrowed his brow in contemplation. Did she want him to walk them to the park and leave them there? Did she plan to introduce him to her parents? Or just hang around in the background while she interacted with them, kind of like some invisible moral support? He knew he needed to give her some kind of response quickly, lest she worry she'd offended him, but when he opened his mouth to ask for clarification, she jumped back in. "I'm sorry. I'm not making any sense. What I meant to ask is, would you come with us to meet them at the park, and maybe stay with us while we visit? I would feel so much better if you were there. Sometimes I just get so flustered and insecure around my parents, and I know if you were there with me, I could be strong." He heard her swallow over the phone. You make me feel strong, Pax. I think I can face them with my head held high if you're with me, and I know you won't let them talk down to me or make me feel somehow, I don't know, less. For a moment, Pax imagined meeting Mr. and Mrs. Farnsworth, politely shaking their hands, then throttling them both for the damage they'd inflicted on their daughter. With no little effort, he corralled his unkind thoughts. If my being there will help you, Lucy, then you can count on me. Oh, thank you, thank you. She sounded giddy with relief, but she quieted quickly, presumably not wanting to wake her babies. Seriously, Pax, thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I know it's a lot to put on your shoulders, but Pax cut her off. These shoulders of mine are pretty broad, you know. I know, she said after a moment, but still, thank you. There's something else you should know. He waited for her to acknowledge that she was listening. What? You should know, Lucy Farnsworth, that you're the bravest, strongest woman I've ever met. Don't you believe anyone who tries to tell you otherwise, not even yourself. He chuckled softly and shook his head, even though he knew she couldn't see him. Hadn't his mother and sister said almost the exact thing to him not more than a week ago, when he'd told them he cared too much for Lucy to foist himself on her, that it was too much to ask someone like her to love someone like him, even though his heart wanted to believe otherwise? Especially not yourself, he repeated. She fell silent for a few moments, and Pax wondered if he'd gone too far, said too much. Finally, she took a shaky breath. That's exactly why I called you, Pax. I knew you'd know just what to say. You always do. The next afternoon, with Itzy dressed in her ladybug costume, complete with red and black polka dot wings and rubber boots, and Ollie in a pair of blue jeans overalls and a flannel shirt, the four of them headed to the park to meet Doug and Verna Farnsworth. The Monday afternoon was bright and breezy, with enough of a nip in the air to require dressing in layers, but not cold enough to give anyone second thoughts about the outdoor setting for their rendezvous. Lucy wore a pained expression on her face, her lips pressed together in a thin line, the hollows of her cheeks pale under the careful makeup she'd applied. But she was dressed for battle, Pax thought, in a bold tomato-red sweater over black jeans and boots. She held her head high and her shoulders back as she pushed her stroller ahead of her, Ollie nodding sleepily in the seat, while Pax walked hand in hand with Itzy. We look like a little family, he thought to himself, and not for the first time. Off on an afternoon walk to the park. They aren't supposed to meet us until 3, Lucy said, glancing over at him with a quick, uneasy smile. So we should have a little time to let the kids play for a while first.
That sounds like a good plan, Mommy, Itzy piped up, because I feel the need for speed, the need for a speedy swing ride, she clarified, waving her free hand back and forth frantically in front of her. Lucy snorted in surprise. Where did you hear that phrase, Itzy? The need for speed? From Gracie. She has all kinds of good sayings for when normal old words don't work.
Pax could easily imagine Grace Winters saying those exact words and meaning them. About a foot taller than the petite Lucy, Grace looked like an Elvgren pinup girl with legs a mile long, dark mahogany hair, and blood-red lipstick. She was, there was no other way to say it, something of a force of nature. Whenever the buxom beauty swirled into a room, the atmosphere changed, the barometric pressure shifted, and all eyes turned her way. But it was Grace's transparent gregariousness that drew people to her. Her ready smile, her bright eyes, her warm sense of humor. Like Lucy and her children, Grace had the ability to see the best in everyone around her. She didn't even live in Pemberton Manor. Her older sister, Sarah, rented the only other apartment on the 3rd floor across from Lucy, but she probably knew more about the people who lived here than anyone else. And she and Sarah had practically adopted Lucy and her 2 kiddos, which meant that, by default, Pax had gotten to know the 2 sisters this last year, too.
Maybe you can push me, Mr. Pax, since you're ginormous and super strong and all that stuff, and I will use my wings to help, too.
Itzy hopped along beside him for several steps, peering over her shoulder to make sure her wings were flapping, too. But when they rounded the bend and the playground area of the park came into view, Lucy reached over reflexively and gripped Pax's forearm. "They're already there," she murmured, then gestured toward a middle-aged couple sitting stiffly on a bench some distance away. Lucy returned her hand to the stroller and took a deep breath, blowing it out slowly in a long whoosh of air. Pax stepped closer to her and rested his palm against the middle of her back. "And I'm already here, too." She halted, then turned to look up at him and gave him a brave smile. "How do I look? I mean, do I look like I've got my act together? Or do I look like the scared little kid I feel like I am?" "You look beautiful," he said without reservation, then grinned encouragingly. "Nothing says, 'Don't mess with me,' like that red sweater on you." She blushed, bringing the color back to her cheeks, then started forward again. Verna saw them approaching first, and she rose from the bench and started toward them without waiting for Doug. Her expression faltered when her gaze landed on Pax, but he smiled, at least on the outside, at her. She was, if by appearance only, an older version of Lucy, and if the Farnsworth matriarch was any indication, Lucy would age quite gracefully. Verna had the same hair as Lucy, albeit a few shades lighter and lacquered in place with beauty products, and Lucy and Itzy's big brown eyes were the older woman's too. She was just as petite and feminine as her daughter, and her husband, when he finally moved into step beside her, was only 5 or 6 inches taller than she was. No wonder Lucy and her children were so tiny. Well, maybe not Ollie, who seemed to get rounder and squishier every day. He had so many rolls under his chin, he didn't even have to use his neck muscles to keep his head up. And there was a good reason Lucy carted him around in the stroller now, rather than the infant carrier. The baby would outweigh his big sister in no time at the rate he was going. Pax released Itzy so she could greet her grandparents, then reached over and covered one of Lucy's shaking hands on the stroller bar. A verse popped into his head, one from Proverbs 31, the chapter in the Bible that talks about the qualities of a good woman. He'd heard his mother share it with his sister so many times while growing up. She reminded June of it yet again over Thanksgiving weekend when they were all talking about plans for the new year, that even he had it memorized. "Strength and dignity are her clothing," he quoted, soft and low, just loud enough for only Lucy to hear. "And she smiles at the future." He gave her hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. "You've got this, and I'm right here if you need me." She nodded slowly, and Pax watched her shoulders relax a bit. Verna hugged Lucy stiffly, not even bothering to wait for her to step away from the stroller. She stood back so Doug could put an arm around his daughter in greeting too. Then they peered down at Ollie, who had drifted off to sleep during the ride over. Verna carefully straightened the collar of his tiny flannel and smoothed the straps of his overalls, while Doug tousled his head affectionately, but not enough to awaken the child. Finally, they both turned their speculative gazes on Pax. This is my friend, Paxton Thayer," Lucy said, stammering just the slightest bit. She rested her hand on his bicep momentarily and met her mother's eyes. "He's the man I told you about, the one who helped us the night Ollie was born. He lives in the apartment below us." Her voice was a little higher than usual, and she was talking quickly, but other than that, she was doing great, he thought. Doug's brow furrowed at the introduction, and when Pax stuck out his hand, it took the older man a moment or two before he decided to accept the handshake. Verna, however, although she'd had extra time to prepare herself to touch him, didn't even try to hide her grimace when she laid her slender, limp fingers in his just long enough to call it done. "Pax," he told him with a polite smile. "Glad to meet you." He was glad to be able to put faces to names, to get a gander at the people who had raised such a wonderful woman, then tossed her out into the world to fend for herself among the wolves. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Itzy tapped Pax's elbow.
"How about that swing ride, Mr. Pax?"
"Say please, Itzy," Lucy reminded her.
"Please will you push me on the swing?"
Itzy amended with a sweet smile up at him, then slipped her hand in his once more. Pax caught Lucy's eye, and she nodded. "Sure thing, Itzy Bug." To Verna and Doug he said, "Excuse me, this one has some extra energy to burn off." As he allowed Itzy to pull him away from the awkward little group, he heard Verna's harsh, accusatory words. "Why didn't you warn us, Lucille?" "Warn you? About what?" Lucy shot back. Pax knew exactly what Verna was talking about. Her distaste had been more than evident when she looked at him, and he thought her daughter did too. But when he glanced back over his shoulder, Lucy was watching him and Itzy, a look of longing on her face. It was obvious she'd much rather be racing to the swings with them than back there trying to stand her ground with her parents. Pax grinned encouragingly at her, lifted his arm and flexed a bicep, not caring what Verna, or Doug for that matter, thought of him. All he cared about was that Lucy knew that he believed in her, that he thought she was the strongest woman he knew, and that she had everything she needed inside of her to face the people who wanted her to believe otherwise. Lucy shot one last smile at him, then directed her parents back to the bench where they'd been sitting. Everyone seemed so uncomfortable, but Paxton made the concerted effort to stop worrying about how things were going between them. Lucy was a full-grown woman who had managed to survive some pretty horrific stuff in the years she'd been on her own. She could handle whatever her parents had come to see her about today, too. And Pax was there to remind her of her God-given strength and dignity, of her ability to smile at the future, just in case she faltered under the pressure of trying to please the two people who kept tearing her down when they should be building her up. No matter how hard he tried, however, he couldn't keep his gaze from drifting in her direction. Not out of worry, though. No, he just couldn't keep his eyes off her whenever she was around. She looked quite stunning, he thought. The deep red contrasted prettily with her porcelain-pale skin and her soft brown eyes. The way she wore her hair, long and loose around her shoulders, made him want to reach out and run his fingers through it. She looked like someone who had it together, and pride, and yes, love, for her, practically radiated from his pores. He hoped she saw it shining out of him. How could Verna and Doug not look at her and be overwhelmed by what an amazing woman their daughter had become? Chapter 6. Pax couldn't stop looking because he was in love with Lucy Farnsworth. Pax was in love with Itzy, who squealed with delight as he pushed her way higher than her mother ever did, and he was in love with Roly-Poly Ollie, the baby whose life he'd quite likely saved more than 10 months ago. Sometimes he was certain the feelings went both ways. In fact, he knew Itzy loved him. She told him so all the time. But a part of him, the part that showed up as his reflection in the mirror every day, the part that reminded him that he had a good 15 years on Lucy, the part that understood what it was like to wake up each morning to a face like his. It was that part that spoke loudly inside his head. Keep your hands and your thoughts to yourself. She's off limits.
Hey, Mr. Pax, how come you aren't a daddy?
Itzy called out as she swung past, almost as if reading his thoughts.
Don't you like kids? You like me, right? And Ollie?
Pax cleared his throat, curious about where the question had come from. I do like you, Itzy, very much. You and Ollie both, he assured her. He opted for the truth. But I haven't gotten to be anyone's daddy yet.
Those two grandparents over there are my mommy's mommy and daddy. Did you know that?
Yes, Pax said, as she swung away from him again.
And I have a mommy, but not a daddy. So maybe you could be my daddy and Ollie's. He doesn't have one either.
Itzy was practically yelling the words to be heard over the wind rushing past her ears, and Pax felt warmth sweep up his neck. Surely the Farnsworth could hear her from where they sat. He couldn't bring himself to look over at them. He had to wrap up the conversation and change the subject fast. Itzy could be quite tenacious when she got a bug in her ear about something. I grew up without a daddy, too, he offered, after slowing her enough that they could carry on their conversation at a more appropriate volume. It was just my mom and my baby sister and me.
That's kind of like us, except the baby around here is a baby brother, and I'm a big sister, Itzy said, apparently so consumed by the conversation that she didn't notice her ride had almost stopped. When she looked up at him with eyes so like her mother's, Pax's heart hurt. But didn't you want a daddy? 'Cause I really, really do.
Pax considered lying to her just to get her off the subject, but he stopped himself. No, this little girl, this child who seemed to carry around an old soul inside her tiny frame, deserved the truth. He stopped her swing altogether and crouched on his haunches in front of her so that they were eye to eye. I had a dad for the first several years of my life, Itzy, and he wasn't a good man. He certainly wasn't a good dad. After he left, I was very sad, but not because I missed him. I was sad because I did want a daddy, but the one I got didn't want me. He didn't want my sister either, and believe me, she was cuter than a mouse's ear.
Ew, a mouse's ear?
Itzy wrinkled her nose as she pondered his words.
I guess that might be pretty cute, but not a rat's ear. Gross.
Pax chuckled at the little girl's logic. You want to know something? My sister's name is June, and when she was a baby, she was roly-poly like your brother over there. I used to think she looked like a cute little Junebug when she crawled around, and I still call her Junebug. Itzy's face lit up, and she stared wide-eyed at him.
Just like you call me Itsy Bug.
Yep, I bet you two bugs would get along just fine together, too.
Is she little like me?
Itzy asked, hopping off the swing, standing straight, and holding her hand up to her forehead to show him just how little she was. No, not anymore. She's a grown-up lady now, more like your mommy's age.
Does she have any kids my size?
She asked hopefully, lowering her hand to her hip. No, she doesn't, but she spends a lot of time helping kids your size. He paused, trying to figure out how best to explain June's job to a child. She travels with a group of people to lots of different places in the world so she can help people who are sick and hungry and thirsty. She teaches them how to grow their own food and find good drinking water, two things that help little bugs like you grow up to be big and strong.
Big and strong like you, Itzy stated, patting him on the shoulder.
Like me, Pax said, shifting from crouching to kneeling so he could stay down on her level a little longer. His back, he'd discovered, wasn't impervious, but the fact that he had the mobility he now did, that he could get into a crouch at all, reminded him to be grateful every single day. Itsy stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, resting her chin on his shoulder.
You would be a good daddy, Mr. Pax. I love you.
He couldn't get any words past the lump that had suddenly risen to his throat, so he just hugged her tightly, marveling at how small she felt in his arms, and kissed the top of her head. Finally he managed, "I love you too, Itsy Bug." Suddenly remembering that they had an audience, Pax pulled back a little and asked, "Do you want to swing some more, or are you ready to go feed the ducks?" Itsy eyed the swing for a moment, then peered around him toward the bench where her grandparents and mother and brother were.
Looks like Ollie's awake now. Maybe we can all go feed the ducks together.
Pax took a deep, fortifying breath, then rose, preparing himself to face the judgment on Doug and Verna's faces once again. He suddenly realized he knew almost exactly how Lucy felt. When he turned around, Lucy was on her feet maneuvering Ollie out of the stroller. She did not look happy. In fact, Pax thought she looked on the verge of tears. Her parents were still seated, their expressions unreadable, but as he watched, Verna straightened the strap of her purse on her shoulder. If luck was on their side, maybe they were already preparing to leave. Itsy took his hand as they started toward the bench, and Pax felt a frisson of concern at how tightly she gripped his fingers. He squeezed back. The poor little thing was watching her mother with concern.
Is it okay if we feed the ducks now?
She asked her mother and grandparents when they drew near, as polite and proper as any 6-year-old could possibly be.
We brought old bread from all the friends at Paddington Manor.
Itsy had an unofficial Save the Poor Ducks campaign. The little girl went door to door in their apartment building about once a week, asking folks to contribute to her duck food bucket so the ducks in the park wouldn't die of starvation. "Pemberton," Lucy said stiffly, her jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with correcting her child's speech. Pax caught her eye and raised a questioning brow at her, but she shook her head almost imperceptibly and repeated, "It's Pemberton Manor, sweetie."
I know,
Itsy said with a nod and a sweet smile.
But I think it would be neat if Paddington Bear lived in our big house, so I just call it that for fun.
Pax would find out from Lucy what was going on soon enough. It didn't take a genius to tell that now wasn't the time to press for details. Now was the time to play along, to play nice, even though he really just wanted to round her and the kids up and get them away from these people that were causing so much stress in their lives. "Makes sense to me, Itsy," Doug said with a chuckle, surprising Pax a little. Maybe not so stiff after all. The older man gave him an acknowledging, albeit stoic nod, but that was more interaction than Pax had expected from the guy. When Doug offered to hold Ollie, Pax's opinion of him notched up even higher. They crossed to the other side of the park where the pond was and spent the next several minutes tossing food at the ducks, Itsy giggling and jumping around to show the birds that she had wings too. In his grandfather's arms, Ollie chortled and squealed gleefully at the show his sister was putting on for him. Emboldened by the ready source of treats, the birds kept coming closer and closer to Itsy until one aggressive drake, his shimmery green wings flapping in a show of bravado, plucked a crust right out of her hands. At first, she seemed thrilled, but then her face crumpled as she looked down at her hand.
"Owie," she
murmured brokenly, trying to hold back her tears.
"That one bit me."
Lucy took the bucket from her and handed it off to Pax, then knelt on the ground in front of Itsy to give her a hug. "You shouldn't let the ducks get so close to her." Verna spoke sharply, her nose wrinkled in the same distasteful expression she'd worn when she met Paxton. "They probably carry all kinds of diseases. We should go now, Lucy. Get her home and clean her up."
"I'm okay, Grandma. I really am,"
Itsy declared bravely. Then she sniffed and swiped at her eyes with the backs of her hands. "Stop! Don't touch your face now, child." Verna lurched forward, making to grab at Itzy's hand. "Your fingers are covered in germs." Lucy pulled Itsy into another hug, and eyeing her mother, she said, "She's fine, Mom. A few germs won't hurt her. In fact, a few germs are good for her." Verna, too, lifted her chin another notch, and with Lucy still crouched down to Itzy's level, Verna looked down her nose, quite literally, at them both. "Well," she murmured, then stepped back and slipped her hand into the crook of Doug's elbow like she was looking for backup. Doug's attention, however, was on a squirming Ollie at his shoulder. At that precise moment, Ollie burped and spit up down Doug's back, somehow managing to get a bit of the mess on the sleeve of Verna's dark green cardigan. "Oh, no!" Verna exclaimed, stepping back and holding her arm out like she'd just been assaulted. "Look what he did! This sweater is brand new."
"It's just baby barf, Grandma,"
Itsy said, a little frown drawing her brows together.
"We can just wash that sweater for you, right, Mommy?"
She turned a questioning look at her mother, but Lucy was already on her feet, reaching out to take Ollie from her father. "Actually, Itsy," she said, not looking at Itsy, instead keeping her eyes locked with Verna's. "Grandma can wash her sweater all by herself. But she's right. It's time to go home, back to our own little house." As Pax watched, Lucy seemed to grow a few inches taller before his eyes. Obviously, something was being decided at that very moment, something important. A line being drawn, a table being turned. He put an arm around Itsy and drew her close to his side, noting the tears that still glistened in her eyes. He could see she wanted to say more, but for once, the child kept her thoughts to herself, practically sagging against him. "You're welcome to join us back at our place for a cup of tea," Lucy said to her parents, stepping back to stand beside Pax and Itsy, propping Ollie on one hip. "I have coffee too, Dad." It wasn't exactly an invitation, but it was far more than what Pax would have offered them were he in Lucy's shoes. "We can rinse your cardigan sleeve out, Mom, and you can borrow something of mine to wear home if you need to," she added. "And Dad, you'll probably have to get that coat dry cleaned, but we can wipe up the worst of it at home." Her father was already slipping out of the coat before she finished speaking. "It's all right, Lucy. I'll have it cleaned later, and I'm perfectly comfortable without it for now." He turned to Verna. "What do you think, dear? Would you like a cup of tea at Lucy's apartment?"
"Maybe I can show you my toys and my books," Itsy said in a subdued little voice. She remained pressed against Pax's side. "I think you would really like them all." Verna smiled grimly at her granddaughter, then glared at Pax like all of this was somehow his doing. She finally shook her head. "No, I think we should wrap this little outing up, Doug. I need to take care of this sweater as soon as possible. It's cashmere and requires special treatment." She turned to Lucy. "You and the children can come home for dinner tonight, though. We are eating at 6 sharp." Lucy shot Pax an apologetic look, linked her free arm through his, then turned to face her mother. "A united front," he thought to himself. "That's what she wants from me right now." "Actually, Mom, we already have plans for dinner, but thank you for the invitation. Maybe another time." Lucy's grip on his forearm tightened, almost in warning. Was she afraid he'd expose her ruse?
Not in a million years. I'm bringing some of my mom's spaghetti sauce, he said with a nod. She makes huge batches of it from scratch at the end of summer, when the tomato flavors are at their most intense. Then she cans it to have all winter long. She sent me home with a few quarts of it when I was there for Thanksgiving. I should shut up now, he thought, getting some secret satisfaction over the way Verna's eyes narrowed at him. Could he make steam come shooting out her ears, too? In as pleasant a tone as he could muster, he added, "Would you like to join us for dinner instead?" Without waiting for the woman's answer, he turned to Lucy. "We could all eat in my apartment since it's bigger." He was banking on the certainty that Verna would never in a million years accept his invitation. As expected, she lifted her nose and sniffed softly, then took a deep, long-suffering breath. "No, I think not. We don't want to impose on your dinner plans." To Lucy she added, "But I do expect you to come to dinner another evening this week. Please call me later so we can set something up." Lucy released Pax's arm to better hold on to her squirming son, but she stayed so close to his side that Pax could feel the heated emotions rolling off her in waves. He placed his hand at her back again and felt her stand taller. He left it there, a tactile reminder that she was not in this alone. "Actually, Mom, I'll have to check my calendar when I get home, but I'll call to let you know when I'm available. It probably won't be this week, though. I have a big deadline I'm working toward, and the amount of free time I have will depend on how soon I can meet it." "Now, Lucy, I'm sure you can figure out how to make room in your schedule to have dinner with your parents. Priorities, dear," Verna quipped. "I know my priorities, Mom," Lucy said. She seemed to be growing calmer by the minute. "I meet my deadlines so that I can get paid in order to provide for and care for Itzy and Ollie. My children, Mother, are my single most important, top-of-the-list priority." Pax wanted to cheer, to throw his arms around her and congratulate her on the stake she just drove into the ground, to comfort her, to soothe the pain she most certainly felt as the words, the sentiment, that should have belonged to her parents, too, came rushing out of her mouth. Pain caused by the knowledge of what was not said. My children are my priority, as your child should have been to you. Chapter 7. "My mom does make some pretty amazing spaghetti sauce," Pax said as he helped Lucy maneuver the stroller, with a fussy Ollie in it, up the front steps to the porch of Pemberton Manor. Itzy was moping along behind them, sad because they'd left the park without getting to swing one more time, and Pax could tell that Lucy was mentally and emotionally teetering. She was likely in no mood to cook. "How about I get you upstairs? Then I'll go grab a jar and some noodles, and we'll whip up a nice meal. You look like you could use a little carb loading right about now." "Do you have any chocolate cake? Or maybe an eclair?" Lucy sighed long and loud, then unbuckled Ollie from the stroller and lifted him out so that Pax could collapse the thing before taking it inside. Sean had given her permission to keep it in a storage closet next to the mailboxes, so she wouldn't have to lug it to and from the third floor every time they headed out. "You know, I haven't had a chocolate eclair in years. I'd sell my soul for one right about now."
"I'd sell my soul for one more swing right about now,"
Itzy bemoaned as she dragged herself up the steps. "I shouldn't have said that, Itzy, and neither should you. It's not something we should ever joke about. You should never sell your soul. Not for anything. Not ever. Not even for another wild swing ride or a delicious chocolate eclair. Selling your soul means someone else gets to tell you what to do every minute of the day. Never, ever, ever, never sell your soul for anything. You hear me, Itsy?" Itsy's eyes grew wider with each word her mother spoke, clearly unprepared for Lucy's adamancy.
"I'm sorry, Mommy,"
she whispered, her bottom lip trembling just the tiniest bit. "Oh, baby girl, it's okay," Lucy said, dropping to her knees, still clutching Ollie, and pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. Ollie squealed and patted Itsy's head. "I'm not upset at you, I promise. I'm just tired and crabby, and maybe a little bit mad at myself right now."
"But why are you mad, Mommy? You didn't do anything wrong,"
Itsy declared, hugging her mother's neck tightly, ignoring her baby brother's grabbing hands. "You're right," Lucy said, but it seemed to Pax that she was talking more to herself than to her daughter. "I didn't do anything wrong, but I certainly thought about it." She shook her head like she was a bit disgusted with herself. "I can't believe I actually considered it," she muttered. "We're going to be okay, little bug. We're home now." Itsy clung to her like a spider monkey, and Lucy staggered as she tried to stand under the combined weight of both her children. "Here, give me the little man," Pax said with a chuckle, and reached for Ollie. Lucy handed him over without arguing. "Oof," he grunted as he hefted the baby up high against his chest. "Little man? I don't think so. He's got to weigh as much as you do, Luce." She grinned at him. "I know he's a chunk right now, but I'm trying to enjoy every moment of it. As soon as he starts walking, he'll lose all those rolls, and I'll miss every one of them like crazy." She reached up and poked Ollie in the belly, making him giggle. "Mommy loves her roly-poly Ollie, right, big boy?"
"I love roly-poly Ollie too,"
Itsy said, but she didn't let go of her mother's neck. Pax turned away to punch in the key code on the front door, his chest tight with love for them. How had he gone through a single day of his life without Lucy and her children before this year? They had filled up every empty nook and cranny in his world, and spilled over into all the places he thought were already full. He held open the sturdy front door and said, "Ollie and I will get the stroller. You go on ahead and see if you can get that old Otis to open up for us." By the time he had the stroller stashed in the closet, the elevator was ready and waiting, and Itsy had recovered enough to man the controls. He stepped inside, slid the cage doors closed, and the old beast started its grinding ascent to the 3rd floor. A couple of hours later, Itsy and Ollie were curled against Lucy in the armchair reading The Wonky Donkey together. Itsy had the book memorized, but she loved having it read aloud to her anyway. Ollie's tired eyes darted back and forth from the exaggerated pictures on the pages to his big sister's animated face, a drooling smile making him look a little drunk. Pax had planned to head home for the evening, but Lucy had changed his mind. "I know you've given up your whole day for us already, but, well, maybe if you don't have to be anywhere right away, maybe you could stick around. I want to tell you what happened at the park today, and I'm not sure I can keep it to myself much longer. I might spontaneously combust or something." He grinned at her. "Can't have that now, can we? No, I don't have anywhere else I have to be, and yes, I'd love to stick around if only to ward off disaster." He hadn't given up anything, truth be told. He'd been given a whole day with them, and now he was gaining a whole evening with them too. So Pax did the dishes while he waited for the tea kettle to boil. Lucy had a French press and a package of ground coffee she kept on hand for his use, so once the dishes were put away, he busied himself preparing her tea and his coffee. While Lucy tucked the kids into their respective beds, Itsy on the futon and Ollie in his crib on the other side of the room, Pax stepped out into the hall to make a quick phone call to his mother. Spending time with Lucy always made him especially grateful for the sacrifices his own mom had made in order to provide for June and him. They'd never had a lot of things to call their own, but neither he nor his sister had ever worried about whether they lived up to their mother's expectations the way Lucy did with Verna. Seeing that painful exchange today at the park between Lucy and her mother motivated him to make sure his mother knew how much she appreciated her. By the time he let himself back into the apartment, Lucy was in the tiny kitchen pouring hot water into her mug. She held the kettle aloft. "Ready for coffee?" she asked. When he nodded, she filled the press with water and settled the carafe lid in place to let the coffee steep. "Mom says hello," he told her. "Your mom?" she asked, turning to shoot a questioning look over her shoulder at him. "Is that who you were talking to out there?" "I was. Watching you with your kids tonight reminded me that I need to thank her more often. You never cease to amaze me, Lucy. Your children are incredibly lucky to have gotten you as their mother." Her hair was pulled up into a messy bun in a clip at the back of her head, so he could see the color creeping up her slender neck to tint her cheeks. "I think that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." She didn't look at him, but added, "Thank you. And tell your mom hello from me next time you talk to her. I hope we get to meet someday." "I'm sure you will," Pax said, crossing the narrow space to stand beside her at the counter. He drew the coffee carafe toward him and slowly pushed the plunger down, then poured the steaming muddy liquid out into his own mug. "Shall we?" he asked, nodding toward the little dinette set she'd recently picked up at a thrift store in town. There were only 3 chairs, which worked out well since Lucy had one side pushed up against a wall. In the middle of the table was a potted Christmas cactus, a succulent named for its winter-long profusion of jewel-colored blooms. The houseplant was lush and healthy, and so large that Lucy had to move it to the counter whenever they ate their meals around the table. She and Itzy had picked it out together 2 years ago. It was Itzy's Christmas gift to her mother, so of course Lucy loved it. And the plant clearly responded to her with the same affection. They sat across from each other, and both eyed the bright scarlet blossoms spilling over the side of the pot between them. "It's never bloomed like this before," Lucy said. "It must be as happy here as we are." Pax made a non-committal noise in the back of his throat. They had grown accustomed to long silences between them, although when the kids were awake, Itzy typically filled the airspace. But Pax wasn't a big talker, and Lucy, who was always working on some aspect of a book, could get lost for long periods of time in her head, and the 2 of them were often content without words between them. Tonight, however, Pax knew Lucy had things she needed to get out of her head, and he was glad she wanted to pour out herself to him. "So, my parents asked me to come home today," she said, after taking a few sips of her still steaming tea. "Permanently." Pax's heart lurched erratically against his ribcage, but then he caught himself before he shouted, "No!" Surely she hadn't agreed to any such thing. He waited, not saying a word, for her to share more. "My mother practically rolled out the red carpet. She said that Thanksgiving had shown her how nice it would be to have us all together more often." She met his eyes, her brows furrowed, looking so much like her daughter that Pax had to resist the urge to smile. "Do you know how stressed out I was that whole meal, Pax? The kids were wonderful, of course, but they were on their absolute best behavior. I warned Itzy within an inch of her life that she had to keep her thoughts inside her tummy, as she puts it, and I made sure Ollie had napped, pooped, and wasn't teething. I even suctioned out his nose before we went, just in case he tried to dig out a booger at the table. Ollie had discovered his nostrils last month, and Lucy was forever dry-heaving because of it. I can't even begin to fathom enduring that every single day, no less 2 or 3 times a day." Pax nodded slowly. It certainly sounded like she'd turned them down, but there was something in her expression that told him it wasn't as easy a decision as he thought it might be. Lucy had admitted to considering it. Hadn't she said as much to Itzy? "Mom even offered to pay me an allowance if we went to live with them. Can you believe it?" Lucy shook her head. "An allowance." Her frown turned into a scowl. She thought I was just sitting around my apartment taking advantage of the welfare system and getting a monthly check. When I told her I was making enough money to support myself and the kids, she simply didn't believe me. Pax still said nothing, but he reached out to brush his fingertips along one arching stem of the spineless cactus. Her gaze followed the movement, and once again color suffused her cheeks. She lifted her cup to blow on her tea, and Pax found his own eyes drifting to her mouth. "Stay focused, Pax. Focus." He, too, lifted his cup and took a long, slow gulp of coffee. It was too hot to guzzle, but the sting of heat helped him rein in his thoughts. "They offered to pay for me to go to college," she murmured quietly, and then in an even lower voice she added, "for Itzy's and Ollie's education, too. They promised me a car that wouldn't break down, the security of never having to eat crappy cheap food again, a garden to grow vegetables and flowers, an enormous yard for the kids to play safely in, and the clout," she held up her fingers in air quotes around the word clout, "of the Farnsworth name in a town that, to my knowledge, no longer makes a big deal about the local blue bloods." Her eyes had gone liquid as she spoke, and now the tears spilled over. "They basically offered me the world, Pax, everything that their money could buy. Except that the world they offered me was theirs, not mine." She swiped angrily at her tears. "And for a moment—" Her voice cracked and broke off, and she shook her head in consternation. "For much more than a moment, if I'm being honest, I actually considered it, and I'm far angrier at myself for considering it than I am at them for offering it." Pax rose and tore a paper towel from the dispenser near the sink, then handed it to her before lowering himself into the chair closer to her, where he could reach out and touch her, and not just her cactus. After she dabbed at her face, he covered one of her hands with his and just held it. Finally, she turned her dark eyes on his and said, "Did I do the right thing, Pax, turning them down? Am I doing what's best for my children? My parents, I know they want the best for my children, and they could give them so much more than I could ever—" Pax stood abruptly, then pulled her to her feet too, surprising her into silence. Without a word, he led her by the hand across the room, first to where Ollie lay sprawled on his back in his crib, his cheeks a little pink from the sunshine of the day, his funny little mouth hanging open. The baby rested in peaceful slumber in his blue and white striped-footed pajamas, one arm wrapped around a little stuffed fox Grace Winters had given him. "That's one content baby right there, Lucy." "I know," but Pax lifted a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently, briefly over her lips. He wasn't sure which of them was more startled by the intimate touch, but he wasn't going to let himself be distracted by the softness of her mouth or the curve of her jaw against his palm. He was on a mission to prove to this woman that everything her children needed, everything she needed, was right here in this tiny studio apartment where love filled every molecule. He ignored his racing pulse and led her over to where Itzy lay on her side on the futon she shared with her mother. When Pax reached down and placed his big hand on the top of the little girl's head, Itzy smiled in her sleep. It was not the reaction of a child who was afraid her needs weren't being met. When he looked at Lucy again, She wore that soft, dreamy look of adoration he saw on her face so often when she watched her children. Finally, she turned to meet his gaze, smiled, and nodded. "They're going to be okay, aren't they? Tell me I'm not going to ruin their lives because I'm too proud to go home, Pax." "Just the opposite, Lucy. Their lives will be all the better for it," he assured her, smiling down into her glistening eyes. "Besides, this is your home, remember?" Then she did something that made Pax's heart nearly stop. She twisted the hand he held so she could lace her fingers with his. "I knew you'd know just what to say." Time seemed to slow as she gazed up at him, a shy smile turning the corners of her mouth up. When her eyes dropped to his mouth, he resisted the instinct to flinch, and he shut out the voice of self-doubt in his head that told him there was no way she could see past his scars and deformities, not really. He remained still, though, letting her study his features, practically daring her to take it all in, to discover for herself what he was made of beneath the mask of his ruined flesh. Lucy let out a soft sound like the release of a breath or a sigh, then lifted their entwined hands to press a gentle kiss to the backs of his knuckles. "You always know just what to say, Pax," she whispered against his fingers, her warm breath on his skin sending a tremor of pleasure up his spine. "I love that you know me so well." Pax had to remind himself to breathe. Then he pulled his hand free of hers so he could cup her face instead. With a quick prayer that he did indeed know her as well as he thought he did, he bent his head toward hers and pressed a gentle, searching kiss on her lips. To his great relief, and even greater delight, after only the slightest hesitation, Lucy rose up on tiptoe and slid her arms around his neck, leaning fully into him as she kissed him back.
"Magical kisses are happening right now,"
Itzy whispered from the futon, then giggled when Pax and Lucy broke apart and stared down at her aghast. "Itzy," Lucy declared, clearly at a loss for what to say to her child, having been caught red-handed, red-cheeked, and, from what Pax could see, slightly red-lipped from the kissing.
"Don't worry, Mommy. I'm going back to sleep now."
The little girl rolled over to face away from them, then turned her head to peer over her shoulder.
"And I already told Pax he could be mine and Ollie's daddy if he wanted to."
"Itzy!" Lucy pressed her palms to her flaming cheeks. Pax, emboldened by Lucy's response to him, slipped his arms around her and drew her close, resting his jaw against her hair as he held her. "It's okay, Lucy," he murmured against her hair. "We have all the time we need to figure this thing out. I'm not going anywhere, and if I heard you right, neither are you." "I'm staying right here," she replied, sliding her arms around his waist and pressing her cheek to his chest. "This is our home. You are my home."
"My home,"
Itzy echoed sleepily. Pax thought his heart might burst right out of his rib cage. Chapter 8. The End of December. Pax stood at the door of Lucy's apartment and straightened the black leather coat he wore over his charcoal gray shirt and black slacks. He hadn't been anywhere that required dressing up in a very long time, and he found that he was nervous. Not because of how folks might respond to his appearance, his scars, but because he wanted to be worthy of being the guy escorting the beautiful Lucy Farnsworth to the winter's New Year's Eve party. Smoothing a hand over the back of his new haircut, he took a fortifying breath and knocked on the door. The sound of scampering feet sounded just before the door was flung open by an exuberant Itzy.
Come in, Mr. Pax. You should see Mommy. She's beautiful, she declared, grabbing his hand and dragging him into the apartment behind her. We've been waiting forever for you to get here so you can see her. Then she eyed the pastry box in his other hand. And what is in there? That's what I want to know. Pax grinned down at the girl and held the box just out of her reach. She was already dressed in a pair of new ladybug pajamas she'd gotten from her grandparents for Christmas. Lucy had taken the kids over to her parents' house for Christmas dinner and to exchange gifts, and from what she'd told Pax, it had been a nice visit. "That's all it will ever be, though, I'm afraid," Lucy had told him. "A nice visit. It makes me sad for my children. They were so ready to get back here to our tiny little Christmas tree and their little pile of gifts. It was almost embarrassing," she'd confided. "But it was a good reminder that they already know what's important, you know?" Pax had put his arms around her and kissed her until all traces of sadness were gone from her eyes. His pulse kicked up a notch at the memory of that kiss. He cleared his throat and peered through the kitchenette into the rest of the apartment. Stella greeted him from where she was sitting on the futon, in the process of getting Ollie into his pajamas too, a task that greatly resembled a wrestling match to Pax's eyes. "Do you need me to hold him down for you?" he offered with a chuckle. Stella laughed and tickled Ollie under the chin, making the little boy squeal gleefully. "Nah," she said, "we got this, don't we, Mr. Oliver, right?" Then she leaned forward and blew a raspberry on his belly. "Mr. Pax!" Itsy tugged on his hand to get his attention. "Please tell me what's in that box. Pretty please. Is it a present?" Pax cocked his head at her and grinned. "This, Itsy Bug, is a box of special treats for special people to share on a special night like this one," he told her. "Do you by any chance know any special people?" Itsy jumped up and down in place, barely able to contain her excitement. I do. I know lots of special people, starting with Mommy and Ollie and Lala and you, and me too." Pax secretly beamed with pride at the way Itsy listed others before herself. It also spoke of what a good mother Lucy was. "Well, I think I have just the right amount of treats for all those people you mentioned, then. You can look now, but you have to wait until Lala says it's time to eat them, okay?" "I promise, honest, cross my heart, and hope a needle doesn't get stuck in my eye," Itsy chanted. Pax chuckled at Itsy's slightly less morbid and somewhat convoluted version of the unbreakable promise pact all children seemed to know. He set the box on the counter. "Let's wait until your mommy comes out, and then I'll show you what's inside, okay?" "Mommy!" Itsy cried, hurrying through the main room of the apartment to the bathroom door, where she knocked on it with her tiny little fist. "Mommy, come quick! Mr. Pax is here, and he brought special treats for special people, and that would be us." Pax straightened as the bathroom door opened, and out stepped Lucy in a floor-length black skirt topped with a ruffled red blouse that sat just off her shoulders. Her long hair was swept away from her face on one side by a red silk rose clip, and the gold hoops dangling from her earlobes sparkled as she moved into the room. When her eyes met his, her shapely lips curved into a scarlet smile. For a moment, Pax forgot his own name. "Wow," he said, trying and failing to get his legs to move. "You look amazing, Lucy Farnsworth. I am one lucky man." "So do you, Paxton Thayer," she said softly as she crossed the room toward him. She slipped into his embrace as though she'd been doing it all her life. "And I am one lucky woman," she said, leaning back to smile up at him. "Me and Lala are lucky women too, Mommy, and Ollie is a lucky man, because Mr. Pax brought treats for all of us." Itsy squeezed in between Pax and Lucy and waved at the box on the counter. Look, Mommy, look!
Lucy shot a sideways look up at Pax. "What did you bring us, Mr. Pax?" she asked, her smile still wide on her pretty face. She looked so happy, so content, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit in love. Pax scooped Itsy up and set her on the counter so she could see inside the box. Then he pried open the tab and lifted the lid. Lucy brought both hands to her cheeks and laughed out loud when she saw what was inside. "You crazy, wonderful man!" She turned and threw her arms around his neck, stretching up on tiptoes and pulling him down so she could kiss him soundly, obviously not worried about smearing her perfectly applied lipstick. "Chocolatey Claire's, Pax?" she said when she pulled back to look up at him.
"And you didn't even have to sell your soul for them, Mommy,"
Itsy declared, clapping her hands. "Nope," Lucy quipped in agreement, then went up on her tiptoes again to whisper in Pax's ear. "I just had to give my heart for them." Then she kissed him again, quickly and soundly, before joining Itsy in exclaiming over the box of goodies, their dark heads bent together in shared delight. "They're perfect, Pax," she said over her shoulder, "especially coming from you." Stella carried Ollie into the kitchen to see what all the uproar was about, then chuckled when she saw his face. "I'm not sure if that colors your shade, Pax." In the bathroom, he made quick work of cleaning up the lipstick smudged around his mouth using a baby wipe from the packet sitting conveniently on the counter next to the sink. For a few moments, he gazed at the man who stared back at him from the mirror, and this time he barely heard the voice that tried to remind him of how broken and battered he still was. He saw not a face marred by tragedy and suffering, but the reflection of a man made whole by the giving and receiving of unconditional love. He could live with that man, he decided, and he thought Lucy, and Itsy and Ollie, might be able to live with him too. He squared his shoulders and straightened his coat, then stepped out of the tiny bathroom and into his future. He and Lucy hugged the children goodnight, then assured Stella, who was babysitting for the evening, that they wouldn't stay out too late. She shooed them out the door and ordered them to have the time of their lives. The Winters party would go until well after midnight, Grace and Sarah had told them, but Pax and Lucy planned to leave early so they could wind down the old year, just the two of them, back home at Pemberton Manor. And to eat chocolatey Claire's and maybe even share a bottle of champagne. And to kiss a few more times under the mistletoe that Itsy insisted they hang in the entryway of the kitchenette. Not that they needed an excuse to do more kissing. And to whisper, "I love you," to each other, for the very first time, right after the last stroke of midnight. And to both agree that it was the absolute best way to welcome in the beginning of a brand new year. We hope you have enjoyed our production of The Mended Man, Pemberton Manor, Book 5, written and narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2019 by Becky Dowdy. Production copyright 2022 by Becky Dowdy. This is a Brave Hearts Press audio production. Thank you for listening.